Hello, this is lecture 4 on the divisions among the Russian ecclesiastical emigres. Regard from Moscow. I'm here for a meeting of interconsular presence. We had just one meeting yesterday and we'll be having another meeting on Tuesday. So it was yesterday regarding theological education and pressing issues of modernity like bioethics, and on Tuesday I will be taking part in the committee on canon law. So speaking of today's theme of today's class, I would like to have some little bit revision, right? So we should keep in mind when we speak about Russian ecclesiastical emigres that we deal with bishops, especially for the first half of 1920s, who brought with them in the diaspora history of relationship. So all of them had complex relations. Many of them, like a Metropolitan Anthony, Metropolitan Evlogy, they had Metropolitan Platon, the leader of the North American Church. They had a complex relationship in Russia. For instance, Metropolitan Evlogy, Metropolitan Anthony, he was in charge of the inspection. He was sent for examination of Kiev's Theological Academy, while Metropolitan Platon was in charge there. So Metropolitan Anthony found various problems there. So, and that gives you an idea that in order to understand better relationships in diaspora, we also need to take into account their interactions, their personal interactions. So that's important. Then we also remember 1921 Council, when bishops divided regarding the issue of the Romanovs, whether Romanovs should remain considered the ruling dynasty. So it also was divisive issue. Okay, and then in 1922, Patriarch Tikhon issued his decree 348, 349 of May 5th or 6th. Don't remember exactly the date. Where he transferred all authority to Metropolitan Evlogy, right? And this decree was drafted in ambiguous language. So Metropolitan Evlogy refused to obey this decree, and Russian bishops in the diaspora also didn't follow it at that point. But then at the council, now this is the subject of this class, at the council of 1926, Metropolitan Evlogy and Metropolitan Platon, they disagreed with bishops at that council, with ROCOR bishops there, and they referred to their right to be directly under the Moscow. So they decided they would be directly under the Moscow and not under the bishops in Serbia. So Metropolitan Evlogy in 1926, since Patriarch Tikhon already reposed, there was Metropolitan Sergius in Russia, Metropolitan Sergius Strogorodsky. He was a substitute to the locum tenens. The locum tenens himself was Metropolitan Peter. Metropolitan Peter was arrested. So Metropolitan Sergius, he was the chief hierarch of the Russian Church abroad at this point. And Metropolitan Evlogy in 1926 sent him a letter explaining all those difficulties and explaining that his understanding of controversy with the Russian bishops in Serbia. So Metropolitan Sergei responded back saying that he could not be a judge to the Russian ecclesiastical affairs since he didn't have enough information. And this is something that connected with his first period, because we do clearly see two different periods with Metropolitan Sergius. The one more conciliar from 1925 until his arrest from December 1925 until his arrest in December 1926, and the other period from March 1927 until his death in 1944. So where he more or less ruled with his own synod and demanding full obedience from all who did not agree with his approach. So next year, Metropolitan Sergius, when he was released from the captivity in the spring of 1927, he issued his famous epistle, an apology to the Soviet government, where he, in the way similar to early Christian writers, tried to convince the Soviet authorities that Orthodox Church was loyal, that Orthodox Church considers them their governance, and the Orthodox Church did not really plot against them. And in order to address particular points that were important to the government, and the probably what government asked him to address, he mentioned that the church is very much against all terrorist activity, and church was against any counter-revolutionary terrorist activity. And also, as a result of this new trend, which was different from Patriarch Tikhon, who was not really very active in issuing sanctions or canonical punishments against Russian ecclesiastical emigres. So Metropolitan Sergius demanded that Russian ecclesiastical emigres would submit pledges of loyalty to the Soviet government. And he explained that this pledge of loyalty meant to abstain from any anti-Soviet statement. And Metropolitan Evlogy, Metropolitan Platon, they initially agreed with this position. I'm not sure if Metropolitan Platon ever sent those pledges to Russia, especially that the United States didn't even have diplomatic relationship until 1940 with the Soviet Union. So, in this situation, Metropolitan Evlogy did send pledges his pledges to Moscow. So, in this situation, Metropolitan Sergei, Metropolitan Evlogy, he claimed that he remained under the Moscow, right? But he only could continue in this way until 1930, because in 1930 he participated in a rally in London for the persecuted Russian Church, and immediately he was summoned by Metropolitan Sergius, requiring to explain how comes that he breached his pledge of allegiance. So in this situation, Metropolitan Evlogy decided that he would also separate from Metropolitan Sergius along the lines of the Russian Church abroad. Basically, it was proven at this point that it was impossible for the Russian ecclesiastical emigres to maintain a relationship with the church in Russia without compromising their attitudes toward persecution. So they could not barely speak any word regarding persecution, and it was a very high price for them to pay in the circumstances of the free world. So in 1930, we now have Metropolitan Eulogy, who went under the Ecumenical Patriarchate. We also had those who didn't follow him, who previously ceased communion with the Russian bishops in Serbia, and who remained properly Moscow Patriarchate. So in Paris, their church was in Rue Pitel, and this is historical three hierarchs parish that remains in Paris until nowadays. And also there was a cathedral of the Sign of the Mother of God Sign in Paris, a Russian Church abroad parish, mostly associated with Russian monarchies and people of royal blood. And majority of parishes in France were under Metropolitan Eulogy. So now, and this kind of represents situations in diaspora, like Metropolitan Sergei Tikhomirov in Japan did not follow Russian Church abroad and remained with the Moscow Patriarchate. Metropolitan Nestor in China was initially with Moscow Patriarchate in 1930, but then he went to the Russian Church abroad, because in China was overwhelmingly Russian Church abroad. I think very few parishes of Moscow Patriarchate, if ever, exist there. And in America, most of the churches were under Metropolitan Platon, who was autonomous. So who also stopped to subordinate to Moscow and became autonomous. Okay. As a result of this division from the position of Russian Church abroad, of the division that happened in the 1926, right, when Metropolitan Platon and Eulogy, they left the Council of Bishops of the Russian Church abroad. Russian Church abroad, the Synod of the, and the Council of the Russian Church abroad, they did issue sanctions against those who separate, and in order to impress people, basically, or not just impress, in order to explain to people the mysteries of Metropolitan Eulogy, were proclaimed void of grace. And that was probably unfortunate wordings, because the status of the Russian Church abroad and status of the bishops of the Russian Church abroad was very irregular, very extraordinary. So in such circumstances, they didn't really have the same authority as they had at the Synod in Russia, the most holy governing synod before the revolution had. Kind of the point was that initially most of Russian bishops, they joined the Council of Bishops of the Russian Church abroad, and in this sense this Council of Bishops represented very impressive conciliar body. It was so quite naturally united, most of them. So in this kind of was point that two bishops separated from this association of bishops, assembly of bishops, right? But in the same time, Metropolitan Sergius Strogorodski's status, who was just a substitute to the locum tenens, also was without precedence. So, and Metropolitan Sergius, he issued sanctions against those who disagree with him, both in the homeland and in the diaspora. And Russian immigrant bishops also did the same. That kind of was maybe overdone, because their own rights were quite problematic. Okay, so that's something that also gives you an idea about all these terminologies that we often hear nowadays when people operate with terms like void of grace and so graceless. And actually, I'm not sure if fathers or holy fathers ever use such terms speaking of those who separated. Maybe some did for pastoral reasons, but in canons you don't find this terminology. Canons deal with heretics, with schismatics, with illegal assemblies, but they never assess quality of their mysteries, sort of salvific component of their mysteries. Right. So after 1930, you will be reading your you will find in your home readings memoirs of Vladimir Rodyanko, who after the 1930s went to Paris, and he presented in a marriage there, and then he went back home to Serbia, and he mentioned to Metropolitan Anthony Hrapovitsky regarding that marriage, questioning him, was this marriage valid, because it was performed by clergymen of Metropolitan Yevlogi. And Metropolitan Anthony Hrapovitsky, he contradicted himself, saying, "Oh yes, of course it was valid, and that's something that also is valuable for me regarding Metropolitan Anthony, that he had very broad pastoral tolerance, so kind of tolerance that I would say compassion, that's the better word instead of tolerance, that he contradicted his own rigid ecclesiology in his pastoral approaches." Right. Since Russians enjoy privileges from the Serbian government, the Serbian king, King Alexander, learned about those divisions among Russian ecclesiastical emigres, right? And he was very unhappy, and also Rodyanko writes about this. So King Alexander, he expressed his wish to the Russian bishops that they would remove all sanctions against their peers in the diaspora. In case they would refuse to do it, he kind of hinted that he wouldn't wish to continue his support unless they reconcile. And also Patriarch Varnava Rosic, the Serbian Patriarch, who studied in St. Petersburg, who respected dearly Metropolitan Anthony, who was ordained by Metropolitan Sergius there, while Varnava was in academy. He became mediator for the Russian diaspora. So with these efforts, in 1975, there was a council, and that council reconciled all Russian diaspora and drafted new provision with districts, with ecclesiastical districts that basically organized all the diaspora into these districts. And Metropolitan Yevlogi went to Belgrade from Paris. They had very peaceful meeting and very brotherly received each other. So Metropolitan Anthony, he even, speaking of his pastoral broadness, he even permitted to Metropolitan Yevlogi, who was technically under the suspension, he permitted to read a prayer of absolution over him, and he read himself prayer of absolution over Yevlogi. And very religious people, sort of very righteousness people, in quotation marks, basically, like Yuri Pavlovich Grabin, a secretary of Metropolitan Antony, who became very important, very prominent for the Russian Church abroad. He questioned the significance and consequences of those acts, because they didn't have any private disagreement. Why would Metropolitan Anthony let Yevlogi to read a prayer over him? Because it wasn't personal, it was a church business, it was not something that Yevlogi sinned against Anthony. So you can see with such logic, this very logical approach, those relations would have never been overcome. And when Metropolitan Evlogi went back to Paris, he was unable really to implement it, so he remained more or less in the same status. He didn't leave the ecumenical patriarchate. So, but the good thing that both churches, Paris Exarchate and Russian Church abroad, they now could serve together, since those canonical sanctions were removed by the Russian Church abroad bishops, and they never have been implemented again. That was an important achievement. Much more fruitful was the relations with the Church in America, when Metropolitan Theophil, the successor to Metropolitan Platon, came back to America. Russian Church abroad bishops there, they just joined North American Metropolia, so and they remained in communion with North American Metropolia until 1946. And during the war years, when North American Metropolia recognized the Church in the Soviet Union, newly established patriarchate with Metropolitan Sergius, Russian Church abroad bishops like Archbishop Vitalis commemorated also Russian Patriarch, because they started to commemorate the Patriarch. Okay, and during this relationship, Metropolitan Vitaly Maximenko, very important for Jordanville figure, who was big in developing Jordanville, in inviting monks from Slovakia, in reinforcing Jordanville. So he presided at the board meetings of St. Vladimir Seminary, because St. Vladimir Seminary was founded in 1938 to mark the anniversary of the baptism of Rus. And while Metropolitan Theophil, who was the president of seminary, traveled to the west coast, Archbishop Vitaly Maximenko would preside over the meetings. But it's incorrect to say that he founded this, as sometimes people say. He didn't really found this. It was a North American Metropolia baby, didn't really connect it with Russian Church abroad at all, regarding establishment of this school. So in Europe, also during the war, Russian Church diaspora was able to minister together in the united spirit toward Russian refugees and people who were forcefully removed from Russia as labor force by the Nazis. So instead of being explained, don't go to that church, this is a bad church, go to our church, basically they were able to preach Christ to those people, and that was very important, and this is a lesson for us today. Okay, so a couple of readings are not ready on this list, but there is still a lot of things, like those 3 readings that are available are good, and they also give you a more nuanced picture about those years. Okay, I hope you find my lectures beneficial, and just get back to me with any feedback. Thank you very much for your attention.